So this story happened to me when I was 15 years old. I was a super lonely kid. My home life was in shambles, mom was cheating on dad, and she told me about it, and I had just started at a new high school the year prior where I didn't know anyone. Creating art quickly became my biggest coping mechanism, and to this day, I still love to draw. I discovered the website DeviantArt around this time, and I started submitting my drawings every day. Through this, I made some friends online of all ages. Some very talented people were giving me positive feedback on my work, and this really inspired me. In my deep depression, I felt like DeviantArt was a safe haven of like-minded people who appreciated one another. For the first time in a long time, I belonged somewhere. I spent many hours talking to some regulars on the site, and even now, 10 years later, a few of them are still in my life and I cherish their friendship. But this story is about someone who I never want to meet, ever again. One day, I was on the front page and a poem caught my eye. It was more of an angry rant, full of weird, twisted imagery and anti-Christian subtext. It sounds stupid, I know, but it was actually quite well written and funny, at least to my 15-year-old self. Being a very angry, depressed high schooler, I was drawn in and decided to check this artist out. Not only was he a prolific writer with maybe 100 poems and stories on his site, this man was a very talented visual artist as well. He created amazing illustrations of weird, funny creatures. Some of them were a little sexual, like naked women, but most of them were humorous or gross. His name was Tom. The combination of Tom's drawings and visual art skills intrigued me. Even though he was 30 years old, I decided to send him a private message. We bonded, and soon we began to talk on AOL Instant Messenger. I would look forward to talking to Tom every day and came straight home after school to connect with him. Chatting for 5 hours was a daily thing for us. In hindsight, my family probably wondered what I was doing, but they never said anything. Anyway, isolating myself in my room wasn't abnormal at this point. I was so grateful for my artistic friend. I could be as stark and confident as I wanted when we talked, and I unloaded a lot of my pain onto him, and he told me about his troubles too. Tom even started to write poetry about me, happy poetry. It made me feel very special because I had softened this angry dude's heart with my friendship, or so I thought. He was reliable, always online whenever I came home. After maybe 3 weeks of talking, Tom asked for my phone number because he wanted to hear my voice. I was extremely uncomfortable with this and reluctant. He insisted and gave me his number to call. Fearing I would lose a friend who was so important to me, I finally gave in. I should mention that I'm 23 now, and I'm still a shy person, but at 15, I was painfully awkward and detested phone calls. My heart was racing, and I was shaky and sweaty as the phone rang. Tom picked up. "Hello?" My voice sounded shaky. But then Tom spoke. I knew his age, but to my relief, he sounded like a teenage boy. This made me feel less uncomfortable, but it still weirded me out. I had no idea what to talk about, and for some reason, I felt like crying. Tom and I spoke for a bit. He laughed at the awkward things I said, so I guess the conversation went all right. Honestly, I can't remember what we talked about. All I remember is that he barely spoke at all. We got off the phone and talked online more. He said how happy he was to hear my voice. I was still pretty upset, but glad that I didn't disappoint him. I hoped he wouldn't ask me to call again because it was such a stressful experience. But I had poured so much time into talking to this man that I was willing to be uncomfortable to preserve our friendship. My self-esteem was basically non-existent. The next day, Tom wanted me to call again. On the phone, I could hear him breathing heavily. Tom was masturbating. I talked about my day at school, some random thoughts, and he stayed silent apart from the breathing. Then, when I was mid-sentence, he hung up on me. When I asked him what happened over Instant Messenger, he told me that I wasn't talking about anything sexy, or something along those lines. I apologized and I felt like a total sense of failure, so the conversation then turned sexual. I told him that I was a virgin, and in reality, I hadn't even had a real first kiss. Tom was overjoyed by this. Now I really had his attention. At this point, it was May. Our relationship progressed to the point that I let him jerk off to my voice, and I even sent him some pictures of me in my underwear when he asked. I had no idea what I was doing, but felt like I had to obey him or he wouldn't be my friend. He started to write poetry about taking a girl's virginity. To his fans on DeviantArt, they were just fictional poems about a fictional girl. But I knew they were really for me. This both thrilled me and made me queasy. My 16th birthday was coming up in June. Tom and I constantly talked about how badly we wanted to see each other. And in the back of my mind, I really missed the days before everything got so sexual. I told him there was no way I could ever fly to Florida, where he lived. Tom insisted on seeing me before my 16th birthday, so eventually we picked a date. He found a hotel near my family's house that was relatively affordable, and even bought tickets to fly out. The plan was that I would skip school that day, and spend a day with him so he could take my virginity. I can't remember if he was even going to stay more than a day, to be honest. Before we said our goodnights, Tom wrote, "Will you let me get your ass too?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement. I came home from school one day, and my mom was extremely solemn. She told me that she knew about Tom. Apparently, I had remained signed in on AOL, but I think she actually got my password to see what I was up to. I began to cry, and I defended Tom at first. But then I admitted that I was terrified of him. I was so ashamed that my mom saw our sexual conversations, but she hugged me and told me, "He won't be coming, I promise." She emailed Tom, which really spooked him. Tom began to yell at me and blow up my phone. He told me he spent $500 on plane tickets that he couldn't get back. I never picked up any of his calls, so he wrote me tons of emails in all caps. I still have a few of them saved. He wrote angry, violent poetry on DeviantArt about how I betrayed him, and I was devastated and hated myself. On the day that Tom was supposed to come visit, I stayed at my best friend's house, which was miles away in a totally different community. My mother gave our apartment building a photo of Tom to make sure nobody let him in. I was totally paranoid that he would pop up for a while after that, but Tom never did. In fact, I didn't hear from him at all. Tom stopped submitting any art or poetry. Over a month went by and Tom was still missing in action. My family and I went to Canada for a music festival, and life was slowly going back to normal. My guilt was fading. Suddenly, in our hotel room, my phone rang. It was Tom. I tried to pick up, and I can't remember why, but for some reason, since we were in Canada, I couldn't talk to him. I think it's because I had an American service provider or something. In any event, he left me messages. My memory of this is very foggy. He may have actually been texting me, I can't remember at all. A few days later, we took a train back to the US, and as soon as we crossed the border, I sent him a text. I apologized for what happened, and I explained that I was in Canada, but that I missed him, and I hoped he could forgive me. Tom told me the reason he was gone for so long. He said that on the day he was supposed to come see me, he got very drunk and tried to kill himself. He stabbed himself all over, including his stomach, left hand, and legs. Feeling last-minute regret, he called his mother, and she called the police. He told me that his whole apartment was considered a biohazard from all the blood, and after he recovered, he spent time in the psych ward. Tom had mutilated himself so badly that the hospital had to amputate his leg, and he lost 2 fingers. He told me that this was my fault. I was utterly speechless, and my blood ran ice cold. I refused to believe him. But lo and behold, he uploaded some pictures of himself on DeviantArt. His leg was amputated above the knee, and he was missing fingers. I had seen previous photos of him. This was my friend, all right. It's hard to explain how I feel about the situation. I feel very sad for Tom, but I also understand that this wasn't my fault. I was a very lonely child and desperate for a friend. Tom was a schizophrenic man and a pedophile. Eventually, he was banned from DeviantArt, and I never talked to him again after age 16. A few years ago, I looked him up and found his profile on a different site. Admittedly, I was Googling him to see if he was still alive. In his profile picture, he was next to a young woman with his hand over her mouth. It looked like he found someone who was willing to visit him after all. So Tom, I hope you're okay, but please, let's never ever meet. P.S. If I take this story down, it's because I am afraid. It's been a few weeks since I came to a very bitter conclusion that my dad may have been stalking someone, and in a way, making me part of it. It's hard to cope with. Every time I really think about it, I feel like I'm having a mini heart attack. I don't like my dad. I haven't liked him since I was old enough to understand that he's a monster to me, and was a monster to my mother. But this just makes it worse. I was still really little when my parents divorced. I didn't understand it much, other than how my parents explained it.
"I hate your mother,"
he told me.
"I hate her so much that if she was drowning, I would hand her a glass of water and sit back to watch the show. And if you tried to help her, I'd stop loving you."
All the while, my mom explained it the way any sane person would. "Mommy and Daddy don't love each other anymore, and we won't live together anymore, but we still love you very much." About a year after the divorce, my dad told me he was seeing a woman named Janet who worked as a ranger at a nearby wildlife refuge where we used to take walks. He said she was separated from her husband. I honestly didn't care, but he seemed happy, so I simply smiled and nodded. He would often talk about her and how he would visit her after work. I remember every couple of weeks I would ask my dad if I could meet Janet.
"Maybe someday,"
he'd reply,
"but now it's not a good time."
That was his answer every time I asked. One time, Dad told me that Janet lived near the beach. I really wanted to meet her after he told me this because I always loved going to the beach. When fall time came around, my dad and I took a trip to the area where she lived to collect shells and beach glass. On the way home, just as it was getting dark, we drove up a dark street lined with a few houses spaced apart from each other. The houses were surrounded by pine trees and had long, winding driveways. We stopped in front of one particular house that Dad told me was Janet's. "Am I finally going to meet her?" I asked eagerly.
"No, not yet,"
he replied.
"Stay in your seat. I'm going to check the mailbox to make sure this is where she lives."
My dad got out of the truck, looked around to make sure nobody was watching, and opened the mailbox, reading every envelope carefully in the waning sunlight. He seemed to get angrier with every envelope he read. He picked one envelope in particular from the rest, put it in his shirt pocket, put the rest back in the mailbox, and slammed the mailbox door hard, enough to echo through the neighborhood. When he got back in the truck, I asked why he looked so angry. It was the kind of anger he got every time he saw my mother. I knew something bad was happening. He didn't say anything, he started the truck back up and drove away a bit too fast. I had just turned 7 before this happened, and to this day, I feel like I was made an accomplice to some kind of crime. Not long after that, I asked my dad one last time if I could meet Janet.
"No, Janet got back with her husband,"
he told me. He looked like he had just taken a bite out of a slice of lemon.
"Neither of us will ever see her."
Being young and stupid and still not able to understand relationships, I tried to assure my dad that he and Janet's husband could still be friends and hang out, but he assured me that it would never happen. It took me way too long to realize that something happened that night. At the age of 7, I was too young to see the holes in my dad's story. Why would he need to check the mailbox to make sure that that was where Janet lived if he claimed he often visited her after work? What was that letter he'd taken from the mailbox, and why was he so angry when he got back in the truck? And why was I never allowed to meet Janet? After talking to some other rangers and welcome center employees at the refuge where Janet supposedly worked, and some who worked there for well over 20 years, I learned that there was never a ranger named Janet who worked there. the last time I asked Dad about Janet, which was when I was about 15, he denied there was ever a Janet in his life, and he got very nervous when I told him that I remember him going through her mail when I was a kid, to the point where he yelled at me. Maybe I'm overthinking this, maybe he was in a relationship that turned sour, but I just find those memories so suspicious. My dad is an angry person who has made my life a living hell for the sole fact that I'm my mother's daughter, and I know asking him about Janet now that I'm an adult would be a very bad idea. This story sort of takes place on and off again throughout most of my life. It starts out as a typical my parents got a divorce when I was young situation, but it unfolded into so much more. As it stands now, my father is dead. It was ruled a suicide, but I think that was only half of what happened. I believe that Mary definitely had a hand in what happened. My mother and father divorced when I was around 4. Almost everyone I know has gone through some sort of similar situation. I have 2 brothers. We saw him about every other weekend. He paid child support. You get the gist. One weekend visit, my father introduces us to a woman he's seeing, named Mary, and something was immediately off to me, but I didn't really start to know what she was capable of until later. I didn't know it at the time, but Mary is one of the main reasons my parents got divorced. My father cheated on my mother with her. He met her while he was working as a waiter at a Red Lobster. When he moved over to his career at a casino as a slot machine repairman, she followed. They got married pretty quickly after my mother and father divorced, and I never knew there was a wedding until later. My mother hated her, but she never badmouthed my dad or Mary in front of my brothers and I. She felt that it was important for us to make judgments for ourselves, even if this woman was part of the reason her marriage was broken up. We continued to visit what was now Dad and Mary's house on our scheduled time with Dad. Mary was just unnecessary drama for a while. Things like buying us toys that we could only keep at Dad and Mary's house, or saying that she and my father wanted custody of us instead of my mom. I feel like these things were harmless in a way. Every divorcing couple probably has some sort of variation. Things carried on like this for a couple of years. I was about 7 or 8 when I remember the first incident that confirmed that I knew this wasn't right. My little brother was a super curious child, and he was about 4. He had scooted a dining table chair to the fridge to get a cereal box on top, and when he reached it, he pulled down a handgun instead of the cereal box. I panicked and got my dad, who acted really funny about it. My memory is fuzzy, but I remember going home early that weekend. My dad didn't know the gun was there because it was Mary's. It was at this point that my mom started to have trouble with us going over there. My father got worse about being able to come pick us up. He was unreliable for the most part to begin with, but I know that he was 10 times worse when he was around Mary. My mom told me later, when I was much older, that Mary called her house around that time of the gun incident and said, "I want your life." My mother is a really tough lady. She grew up in East LA in California, but this scared her. I guess what Mary meant was that she wanted my mom's stability. Even as a single mom with 3 kids, she was doing very well for herself, and even dating. But even so, how long had Mary been obsessed with my mom before she and my father got divorced? Not long after the call, my mom heard her car being smashed into one night. Someone had taken a brick and smashed the driver window. Nothing was taken, but I know that it was Mary. We had no way to prove it, but I just know. My dad and Mary had a baby. Her name is Madison. My mom met and married my stepdad pretty soon after that, and they decided that it would be best to move to Florida. We had other family there, and there weren't many jobs where we were living in Tennessee. I don't remember any problems at all when we were so far from my dad and Mary. We stayed for about a year, and then we moved back to Tennessee. My stepdad was able to get a better job again, and we were closer to my mom's parents. This is when the phone call started. As soon as we moved back, we would get phone calls where someone would just listen for a few minutes and then hang up. The numbers were always blocked, but I'm sure it was Mary. She always knew where we lived because we started seeing my dad again. The calls continued for years and became like an inside joke. We all knew who it was, but there wasn't anything we could do. My father denied it. Anytime I asked him about him, he took her side. We fell into this thing where my mom was the bad guy, and anytime I questioned my dad and Mary's behavior, they were sure my mom was putting me up to it. Things escalated one night when my dad came to pick us up for a visit. My mom and Mary ended up getting into a fist fight, where Mary swung first, and my mom punched her so hard she fell backwards. My brothers and I watched from the apartment where we were living at the time. Mom went immediately to the police, but my dad and Mary never even called. Mom didn't press any charges, and the whole incident sort of faded away. We ended up moving into a big house a while after that, where we still are today. Dad and Mary started to have problems and split up. I thought maybe she would be gone for good, or at least gone for the most part. But she never really went away. My dad started to become a person we could somewhat rely on again when she was gone. I got to know my little sister, the baby they had, and things were okay. She started coming around again though. Whenever she was with my dad in front of us, she would whisper in his ears. My dad would drink more. He became physically ill-looking and would start to gain weight. We could always tell when Mary was around because the difference was so drastic. He even officially divorced her at one point, but it was obvious that they still got together off and on. My brothers and I went on with our lives, and we became too old for visiting the way we were. Whole weekend visits became just going to see my dad for an evening. The whole time, however, the calls never stopped. They weren't as frequent, but they were there in the background, like a reminder that she was always there, lurking. When I got into high school, visits from my dad just about stopped altogether. We usually talked on the phone here and there, and I saw him when I had events like marching band competition, a formal dance, milestones like graduating from high school. It was pretty common to go a while without hearing from him sometimes. Mary was only a thought. I hadn't seen her in years, and I never saw her anywhere at all. The phone calls had stopped, but only because we had gotten rid of the house phone. I was a freshman in college, and I remember it being around Halloween of 2009. I was shopping with my aunt for some cheap decorations at the Walmart by my house, and I saw a woman walking slowly behind us. My aunt and I both did a double take. It was Mary. She was totally following us around the store. She looked like she was maybe 50 years older than when I last saw her, and her clothes were disheveled. My aunt kept elbowing me to go talk to her because we weren't exactly sure if this was really her. It could have been someone who just looked really similar. I worked up the nerve and went up to her. "Is your name Mary?" I asked. "Yes, it is. Hi, Samantha. How are you?" Using my name like that really caught me off guard. I asked her if she had talked to my dad lately because it had been a while since I heard from him. She swore up and down that she hadn't spoken to him for months, which I later found out was a lie. This was the beginning of my dad going missing. After I saw her, something happened, and it's hard to pin down what, but he completely disappeared. His cell phone was shut off, and when I called his work at the casino, where he had been working for 15 years, they said that he was no longer working there, and couldn't tell me why. My mom and brothers and I called the police to file a missing persons report. We didn't have to wait because it had already been several weeks since we had heard from him. They helped us make a flyer, and we looked and asked all over. Everything led back to Mary most likely being the last one to see him. By the time we started talking to her, it was mid-November. My mom and I called Mary, and she said that, in fact, she had seen my dad on the night after Halloween. Mary told us that he was making a noose, and this would be the last time anyone ever saw him. We honestly didn't know what to believe. My dad was an alcoholic. It wasn't uncommon for him to say dramatic stuff, but we never considered suicide. When we told detectives what Mary told us, they had her come in for questioning. She had told the detectives a completely different story, and her dates kept changing. There wasn't any evidence of anything though, so there wasn't much they could do. The detectives did, however, tell us that we shouldn't talk to her anymore. To quote them,
"We don't know what she's capable of."
Things went on like this until they found him on January 4th, 2010. My dad was found dead in a storage unit. He had pulled his car in, shut the unit door, and let it run until he died. And he had been there for 63 days. There were several suicide notes, all dated for November 2nd, one for my mom, and one for each of his children. But there was an especially long note for Mary, where he doted on her and talked about what a wonderful woman she was. The suicide note even said for her to take any insurance money and use it on herself. The date on the notes was so close to the date where Mary said she had seen him. There are a million things that could have happened, but I know that she had something to do with it. Even if my father really did kill himself, I know that she helped push him over the edge. I'm not one to just blame someone. I know my father was a troubled man. He was an alcoholic, and he was depressed most of the time, usually because of Mary. But there's something so frustrating and horrendous about this woman, and there's zero evidence for me to prove anything against her. She wasn't allowed to come to his funeral. My mom and parts of his family put everything together. There wasn't anyone he knew that hadn't heard of her, and everyone felt that she was a bad woman. I found a Facebook profile of hers months after they found my dad. There were only 5 or 6 photos of her and some guy obviously happy. And they were all dated for January 4th, 2010. The next year, on January 4th, 2011, she showed up at my family's house. We didn't let her inside, and she kept saying something about having some stuff of my dad's in the car. We told her to leave, or else we would call the police. That night, someone put red tissue paper in and around our mailbox. Even the next year, she called my mom and asked her to meet her in a Sonic Burger parking lot. She said she had a box of my dad's stuff to give us. My mom made my stepdad go instead of her, but she never showed. I feel like she wanted to do something bad to my mom. The next year, we didn't hear from her. I did some research and it turns out that she was put in jail for making meth. Supposedly, she was let out sometime last year, the summer of 2014. The correctional facility she was at has a website, and it says that she was let out for good behavior and rehab. I found a different Facebook profile that showed her with some other family. God help them if she's pulling the same crap as she did with mine. Today, I have no idea where she is, and until I can move far away, I don't want to see Mary ever again.